The first time she acknowledged me, she didn't ask my name, didn't glance at my screen, and didn't slow her stride long enough to register that I was already in the middle of something complex. She stopped just long enough to drop her coat onto the corner of my chair and said, "Handle the equipment," in a tone so casual it assumed compliance as a given. There was no hostility in it, no visible disrespect which somehow made it worse. It was the kind of authority that doesn't feel the need to announce itself, because it believes the hierarchy is self-evident. She was the new VP, recently hired to modernize operations and bring a visible sense of momentum to areas leadership believed had grown too careful. I picked up the coat, handed it to her assistant without comment, and returned to my work, already aware that moments like that tend to reveal more about an organization's future than strategy decks ever do. What she didn't know and never asked was that the equipment she gestured toward wasn't a peripheral support function or a background utility that could be casually delegated. It was the structural backbone of the company's most sensitive operations, touching licensing enforcement, regulatory compliance, data integrity, and cross-border exposure. These were systems the board rarely discussed in detail because, when they function properly, they disappear into the background. I had built and maintained most of them over years, not for recognition or ownership, but because I understood how quickly revenue becomes fragile when safeguards are treated as optional. At this level, failure doesn't announce itself with alarms. It arrives quietly in penalties, revoked agreements, and relationships that never fully recover. Her arrival shifted the atmosphere almost overnight. Meetings grew louder and faster, filled with confident language about acceleration, disruption, and removing friction. She spoke fluently about empowering leadership by trusting judgment over process, and about eliminating what she saw as unnecessary guardrails. When questions came up about segmented access, audit trails, or approval chains, she framed them as remnants of a cautious era that no longer applied. I answered what I was asked, documented every change I touched, and said nothing more. Experience had taught me that enthusiasm often outruns comprehension, and that arguing with momentum usually just paints a target on your back. This code incident turned out not to be an anomaly, but a preview. Requests began to arrive that assumed execution rather than discussion. Temporary access without clear expiration. Data exports, justified vaguely as offline. Review. Permissions, expanded just for now to keep things moving. None of it violated policy outright. None of it was illegal. Each request came through the correct channels, carried appropriate approvals, and was framed as reasonable under the circumstances. I executed every one exactly as written, knowing that systems don't interpret intent. They record behavior. Over time, the volume changed. Access requests outside normal operational windows became more frequent. Large datasets were downloaded repeatedly, sometimes redundantly. Late-night sessions appeared from networks that didn't meet the usual security profile. Individually, each action was defensible. Collectively, they suggested a growing comfort with risk that hadn't yet encountered consequences. I didn't intervene or escalate prematurely. I let the system do what it was designed to do, observe patiently, log everything, and preserve context without emotion. The board review that followed wasn't triggered by her actions, and that detail mattered. Accountability rarely begins with accusation. It started as a routine governance audit, scheduled long before her arrival, driven by auditors asking neutral questions about access, patterns, and exposure management. Someone requested a breakdown of recent activity tied to sensitive repositories. The response wasn't curated or interpretive. It was chronological, comprehensive, and precise. Logs don't speculate. They don't soften impact. They simply show what happened. when it happened, and how often. That was the moment the room shifted. The conversation moved away from vision and into judgment. Not what data existed, but why it had been accessed so frequently. Not whether permissions were technically approved, but whether they were necessary. Download history isn't concerning because of content alone. It's concerning because it reveals decision-making, habits when people believe oversight is distant. Patterns that felt harmless in isolation became uncomfortable when viewed together, stripped of narrative and intent. I wasn't in the room for the discussion that followed, and I didn't need to be. Systems don't require witnesses to speak clearly. In the weeks that followed, the organization's behavior changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Requests slowed, access scopes tightened, emails became more carefully worded. Meetings that once rushed past technical detail began to linger on it. The coat never touched my chair again, and no one referenced the incident. Eventually, her calendar grew sparse. Approvals that once carried her name stopped appearing in workflows. Then her name disappeared altogether. There was no announcement, no explanation, no dramatic exit. Just absence, framed internally as a strategic realignment. The organization adjusted, as it always does, while the systems beneath it continued their quiet work, unchanged. What stayed with me wasn't satisfaction or vindication. It was confirmation. Organizations rarely falter because of villains or bad intentions. They falter when confidence outpaces understanding, when visibility is mistaken for competence, and when safeguards are dismissed as obstacles instead of protections. The most critical work is often done by people. No one notices until the moment it becomes essential. Didn't gain power through that experience. I already carried responsibility. The difference is that responsibility leaves evidence, and evidence doesn't care about titles, tone, or assumptions. It only reflects what you do, repeatedly and consistently, when you believe no one is paying attention.